the woman who refused to give up, a story of faith, courage, and divine timing. Welcome back to our channel, where faith meets real life. This story will touch your heart and remind you that God's timing is always perfect, even when we can't see it. This is the story of Jessica, a modern-day woman whose journey mirrors the faith and perseverance of the women we read about in Scripture. If you've ever felt like giving up, if you've ever wondered if God has forgotten about you, or if you're walking through a season that feels impossible, please stay with me until the end. This story will show you that sometimes our greatest victories come disguised as our most challenging defeats, and that God is always working behind the scenes, even when we can't feel His presence. So, grab your cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and watch the video about a woman who discovered that her wilderness season was actually her preparation for a miracle. Jessica had always been a dreamer. Even as a little girl, she would spend hours writing stories, creating worlds where broken hearts were mended and dreams came true. By her 20s, she knew with absolute certainty that she was called to be a writer. Not just any writer, but someone who would use her words to bring hope to hurting women around the world. She reminded me so much of the woman in Proverbs 31 who considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. Jessica had that same entrepreneurial spirit, that same determination to build something meaningful with her gifts. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Jessica spent her days working at a corporate job that slowly drained her soul. Every morning, she'd wake up with a heaviness in her chest, knowing she was trading her precious hours for a paycheck instead of pursuing her calling. She'd come home exhausted, with barely enough energy to write a single paragraph, let alone the book that burned in her heart. For years, she tried to balance both worlds. She'd wake up at 4 a.m. to write before work, sacrifice weekends, and push through the exhaustion. But it felt like she was running on a treadmill, working harder and harder, but never getting anywhere. Like Hannah in 1 Samuel, who was barren and desperate for a child, Jessica felt barren in her creativity. She had so much to give, so many stories to tell, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to break through. The rejections from publishers piled up like stones, each one making her question whether she had misheard God's voice. Maybe I'm not meant for this. She would whisper to herself during those dark 3 a.m. moments when doubt crept in like a thief. Maybe I'm just fooling myself. But something deep inside her, a voice that sounded like her creator, kept whispering back, not yet, but soon. At 35, Jessica faced what she later called her wilderness years. Her father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and suddenly her world shifted completely. The corporate job that had felt like a prison now became her lifeline, the insurance and steady income that allowed her to care for the man who had raised her. Writing became a luxury she couldn't afford. Between work, doctor's appointments, and the emotional weight of watching her father slowly disappear, Jessica felt like she was drowning. The dream that had once felt so certain now seemed like a cruel joke. I think about Moses during this season of Jessica's life. He spent 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep, probably wondering if he'd misunderstood God's plan for his life. The man who was called to deliver Israel was changing diapers and dealing with the mundane struggles of caregiving. Sound familiar? Jessica's days blurred together in a haze of medical appointments, insurance claims, and the heartbreak of watching her father's brilliant mind fade away. She'd find him sometimes, staring out the window with confusion in his eyes, and she'd wonder if God had forgotten about both of them. Her friends meant well, but their encouragement felt hollow. This is just a season, they'd say. God has a plan. But when you're in the middle of the wilderness, it's hard to see anything but sand and stones. The writing dream felt like a distant memory, something she'd once been naive enough to believe. Jessica began to wonder if she'd been wrong about her calling entirely. Maybe she was meant to be a caregiver, not a writer. Maybe the corporate job was her true purpose, and the writing was just a foolish fantasy. During this time, Jessica clung to the story of Ruth. Here was a woman who had lost everything: her husband, her future, her security. But Ruth made a choice that changed everything. She chose to stay faithful, to keep moving forward even when she couldn't see the destination. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay, Ruth had declared. Jessica began to see that her wilderness wasn't abandonment, it was preparation. She was learning compassion, resilience, and a depth of character that would later pour into her writing in ways she never could have imagined. Part 2. The Quiet Miracles. After 2 years of caring for her father, Jessica began to notice something subtle but profound happening. The experiences that had felt like detours from her calling were actually becoming the foundation for it. In the waiting rooms of medical offices, she found herself naturally connecting with other caregivers, mostly women carrying similar burdens. She'd listen to their stories, offer encouragement, and somehow find exactly the right words to bring comfort. It was as if all those years of wanting to write healing words for women were being practiced in real time. One conversation at a time. Jessica started carrying a small notebook, not for her writing dreams, but to jot down the wisdom she was learning from these unexpected teachers. Women like Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been caring for her mother for 6 years and still managed to find joy in small moments. Or Jennifer, a young mother whose husband had suffered a traumatic brain injury, who taught Jessica that strength isn't about not falling down, it's about getting back up. This reminds me of how God prepared David for kingship. While David was tending sheep in the wilderness, facing lions and bears, he was actually developing the courage and faith he'd need to face Goliath. Jessica's wilderness was her training ground, though she didn't know it yet. One evening, as Jessica was helping her father with dinner, he looked at her with surprising clarity and said, "You know, sweetheart, you've become quite the writer. You write hope into people's hearts with your words." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. Her father, in his confusion, had seen something she'd forgotten about herself. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Jessica opened her laptop and began to write. Not the novel she'd always planned, but something different. She wrote about the woman in the grocery store who had cried when Jessica asked if she was okay. She wrote about the strength she'd witnessed in the hospital chapel. She wrote about finding God in the most unexpected places. The words flowed like water after a drought. But more than that, they carried a weight and authenticity that her earlier writing had lacked. Jessica realized that her wilderness years hadn't stolen her calling, they had refined it. Jessica's father passed away on a Tuesday morning in spring. After the funeral, after the relatives had gone home, after the casseroles had been eaten and the thank you notes written, Jessica found herself facing a choice she hadn't expected: freedom. For the first time in years, she could make decisions based on her own path, rather than someone else's needs. The corporate job that had once felt like security now felt like a cage. But Jessica was different now. The woman who had entered the wilderness was not the same one who emerged. She had learned to trust God's timing. She had learned that sometimes the most important work happens in the quiet, unseen moments. She had learned that her calling wasn't just about writing it, was about understanding the hearts of women who were struggling, because she had become one of them. Jessica made a decision that would have terrified her 5 years earlier. She gave her notice at work. Not to chase a dream this time, but to step into a calling that had been refined by fire. Within a month, something amazing happened. A small Christian publishing house reached out to her. They had seen some of her recent writing pieces she'd shared on social media about caregiving and faith, and they wanted to know if she'd be interested in writing a book for women going through difficult seasons. Jessica laughed out loud when she read the email. Wow. It was exactly what she'd been writing about. Exactly what she'd been living. The book they wanted wasn't the novel she'd originally planned, but it was somehow better. It was real, it was necessary, and it was uniquely hers to write. This reminds me of Esther, who became queen not through her own ambition, but through a series of circumstances that seemed tragic at the time. God had positioned her for such a time as this, just as he had positioned Jessica. Part 3. The Harvest Season. Jessica's book, Finding Grace in the Wilderness, A Woman's Guide to Thriving in Difficult Seasons, became a bestseller within 6 months. But more than the success, it was the letters from readers that confirmed she was exactly where God wanted her to be. Women wrote to tell her how the book had helped them through divorce, illness, job loss, and grief. They shared how her words had reminded them that they weren't alone, that their struggles had purpose, and that God was working even in their darkest moments. Jessica realized that if she had gotten her dream job as a writer 10 years earlier, she never would have had the experiences necessary to write this book. The wilderness years that had felt like punishment were actually God's way of preparing her for the work he had planned all along. Like Joseph, who told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done. The saving of many lives. Jessica could see God's hand in every difficult season. The corporate job had given her financial stability during her father's illness. The caregiving years had given her empathy and depth. The wilderness had given her wisdom. Today, Jessica speaks at women's conferences around the country. She has written 3 more books, each one touching on the themes of faith, resilience, and finding purpose in pain. But when people ask her about her success, she always points back to those wilderness years. "I thought God had forgotten about me," she says. "But he was actually preparing me for something bigger than I could have imagined." The lessons we learn. Jessica's story teaches us several powerful truths that we need to remember. First, God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't feel like it. Jessica wanted to be a writer in her 20s, but she needed to become a caregiver in her 30s to have something worth writing about. Remember that God's delays are not denials, they're preparations. Second, our wilderness seasons are not punishments, but preparations. Every difficult season in our lives has the potential to become our greatest qualification for the work that God has planned for us. The pain we experience today may be the very thing that allows us to bring healing to others tomorrow. Third, God uses our ordinary moments to build extraordinary character. Jessica's most important training didn't happen in a classroom or conference room. It happened in hospital waiting rooms and around her father's dinner table. God was building her capacity for compassion with every difficult conversation and sleepless night. Fourth, our calling often looks different than we expected, but it's always better than we imagined. Jessica thought she wanted to write fiction, but God had called her to write hope into the hearts of hurting women. Her actual calling was more meaningful and impactful than her original dream. Finally, God is always working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. Every rejection letter, every exhausting day, every moment of doubt was actually God positioning Jessica for her ultimate purpose. He was weaving together all the threads of her story to create something beautiful. Conclusion: your story is still being written. As I close Jessica's story, I want you to know that your story is still being written. If you're in a wilderness season right now, if you're wondering if God has forgotten about you, if you're tempted to give up on the dreams he's placed in your heart, remember Jessica. Remember that God's timing is always perfect. Remember that your current struggle may be your future strength. Remember that the same God who turned Jessica's wilderness into a platform for hope is the same God who holds your future in his hands. Your wilderness season is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of something beautiful. Keep walking, keep trusting, keep believing that God has something incredible planned for you. Even if you can't see it yet, God has not forgotten about you. He's preparing you for something amazing. Trust his timing, embrace your season, and watch as he transforms your pain into purpose, your mess into a message, and your wilderness into a testimony that will encourage countless others. Your breakthrough is coming. Your purpose is being refined. Your calling is being prepared. And one day, you'll look back on this season and say, just like Jessica, "I thought God had forgotten about me, but he was actually preparing me for something bigger than I could have imagined." Your story is far from over, it's just beginning. If this story encouraged you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend who needs to hear this message today. And remember to subscribe for more inspiring stories that will strengthen your faith and remind you that God's love for you is endless.